October 3rd, 1942, 1:49 p.m. Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea. A slender 46-foot-tall rocket ascended from its launch pad. For the first time in human history, an object created by human hands pierced the boundary of space. The V-2, officially Aggregate 4, reached an altitude of 52.5 miles and a speed of 3,580 miles per hour. In the control room stood a 30-year-old German engineer named Wernher von Braun, tears welling in his eyes. He whispered to his colleague, "Today, spaceflight was born." What von Braun couldn't possibly know at that moment was that his rocket wouldn't just change the course of World War II, it would also carry humanity to the moon. The very same hands that crafted a weapon would later realize mankind's greatest dream, but the path to get there was paved with blood, moral compromises, and one of the most controversial sagas in the history of science. 22 years later, on July 16, 1969, a rocket called Saturn V would launch toward the moon. Its chief architect, none other than Wernher von Braun, its technology, a direct evolution of the V-2. The story of this transformation is extraordinary, shattering, and absolutely true. Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun was born on March 23, 1912 in Wiersitz, Prussia. His father was a baron and a politician. His mother, an aristocrat, who gifted him a telescope for graduation. This gift changed his life forever. The young Werner, captivated by the stars, devoured the rocket into interplanetary space by Hermann Oberth. He didn't understand a word of the mathematics. So he resolved to master math and physics, all to reach the stars. At 18, he joined the German Rocket Society, experimenting with liquid rocket propellants in Berlin. By 20, he had already built small rockets. But in 1932, a man arrived who would change his life forever. Captain Walter Dornberger of the German Army was seeking talent for military rocket development. Germany was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles from building long-range artillery, but rockets weren't mentioned in the treaty. Dornberger offered von Braun unlimited research funds. The price, military application. Von Braun, just 20 years old, dreaming of the stars, accepted. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1937, the Peenemünde Army Research Center opened, a sprawling research facility on Usedom Island. Von Braun became technical director at just 25 years old, with a budget of millions of US dollars and thousands of engineers. He began developing a rocket that could fly 186 miles and carry a ton of explosives. The technical challenges were immense. No one had ever built a rocket engine that could burn long enough. No one knew how to stabilize a rocket at high altitude. The combustion chamber temperatures reached 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt any known metal. Von Braun and his team invented solutions. They developed turbopumps that could pump 40 gallons of fuel per second. They invented cooling systems that pumped fuel through the combustion chamber walls to cool them down. They developed gyroscopic stabilization systems for precise flight control. Each problem was solved through brilliant engineering. What they created was not just a weapon, it was the dawn of spaceflight technology. The successful launch in October 1942 was a triumph. Hitler, initially uninterested in rockets, changed his mind after the catastrophic defeats in Stalingrad and North Africa. In 1943, he visited Peenemünde and saw a V-2 film. Suddenly, he ordered mass production. 12,000 V-2 rockets were to be built. Von Braun was thrilled about the resources, but increasingly uneasy about the direction. The SS under Heinrich Himmler took over production. They built an underground factory called Central Works near Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains. 60,000 forced laborers and concentration camp inmates were forced to work. The conditions were brutal: 16-hour workdays, minimal food, no daylight. 20,000 people died building the V-2 rockets, more than the rockets themselves would later kill. Von Braun visited Central Works several times. What he saw and knew became hotly debated after the war. He later claimed he had no choice. Critics argued he was actively involved. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. He was a brilliant engineer, obsessed with his vision, who made moral compromises to realize his dream. September 8, 1944, 6:43 p.m., London. A massive explosion rocked Chiswick, a suburb of the British capital. 16 seconds later, people heard a strange noise like a rumbling thunder. Only after that came the supersonic boom. The first V-2 had hit London. There was no warning, no air raid siren, no sound before impact. The rocket was faster than sound. It came out of nowhere, from the stratosphere, traveling at 2,200 miles per hour. 3 people died. In the next 7 months, over 3,000 V-2 rockets would be fired at England and Belgium. 9,000 people died. The psychological effect was devastating. You could fight the Air Force. You could take shelter in bunkers from bombs. But against the V-2, there was no defense. It came too fast, too high. British intelligence launched desperate operations to find and destroy Peenemünde. In August 1943, 596 British bombers bombed the facility, killing 735 people and delaying the program by 2 months. But they couldn't stop it. But then, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. September 1944, a V-2 rocket crashed in Sweden, largely intact. Swedish and British engineers disassembled it in every detail. What they found shocked them. The V-2 was not just a weapon, it was a technological wonder. The turbopump produced 680 horsepower. The guidance system used analog computers that calculated the trajectory in real time. The combustion chamber generated 25 tons of thrust. The rocket fuel, liquid oxygen and ethanol, burned at a controlled 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A British engineer wrote in his report, "The Germans are at least 10 years ahead of us in rocket technology. If the war were to last longer, they could build intercontinental missiles." The Americans reading this report immediately realized they had to have this technology, and they had to have the men who developed it. By the end of 1944, it was clear that Germany would lose the war. Von Braun and his team knew it. They faced a choice: surrender to the Soviets, who were coming from the east, or the Americans in the west. The Soviets were known for deporting German scientists to Russia. The Americans offered better prospects. Von Braun made a decision. In February 1945, he began to secretly hide documents: 14 tons of technical drawings, test data, construction plans, the complete documentation of the V-2 program. Were hidden in an abandoned mine near Durnton. In March 1945, von Braun evacuated his team of 500 engineers to Bavaria, away from the Eastern Front. They waited for the Americans. On May 2, 1945, a week before the German surrender, von Braun's brother, Magnus, surrendered to American troops. He said, "My brother invented the V-2. We wish to surrender to the Americans." The Americans could barely believe their luck. That was the moment the American intelligence service launched a desperate plan. As early as the summer of 1945, American and British teams began systematically searching for and recruiting German scientists. The operation had a cynical code name: Paperclip. Why Paperclip? Because American officers attached paperclips to the files of valuable German scientists. The problem was, many of these scientists were Nazi Party members or had worked for the SS. Under American law, such individuals were not allowed to enter the US. The solution was shockingly simple. Documents were falsified, memberships were erased, biographies were rewritten. The American Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency created new files, in which the Nazi past disappeared. President Truman personally approved the operation, even though it violated his own instructions. The justification: the Cold War had begun. The Soviets were also recruiting German scientists. America could not afford to fall behind. September 16, 1945, Wernher von Braun and 126 of his best engineers boarded an American ship in Cuxhaven. Destination: Fort Bliss, Texas. They brought their families with them, over 1,800 people in total. They also brought the 14 tons of hidden documents. The Americans also brought 100 complete V-2 rockets from Germany, disassembled and packed in crates. In Texas, Von Braun and his team began teaching the Americans everything they knew about rockets. They reconstructed V-2 rockets from the imported parts. From 1946 to 1951, 67 V-2 rockets were launched, tested, and modified from White Sands, New Mexico. American engineers learned by observation, but the Germans were indispensable. Without von Braun, the Americans would have taken years to understand the technology. The moral questions were ignored. When an American journalist reported on the Nazi past of some paperclip scientists in 1947, the story was suppressed. The government lied. These men were never Nazis. The truth remained classified until the 1980s. In 1950, von Braun and his team were relocated to Huntsville, Alabama. There, they built the Redstone Arsenal for the U.S. Army, a rocket testing center. They developed the Redstone rocket, a direct development of the V-2. Bigger, more precise, more powerful. The Redstone was America's first medium-range missile, but more importantly, it was the prototype for everything that came after. Von Braun's team worked like they were obsessed. They had proven to the Americans that they were valuable, but they had to continue to deliver. The Cold War escalated. The Soviets had also recruited German scientists and were developing their own rockets. In 1953, the Soviets tested their first hydrogen bomb. In 1957 came the shock. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. America was appalled. How could the Soviets be technologically ahead? Von Braun had warned years earlier, "Give me the resources, and I will take you to space." The army had refused, too expensive. Now, after Sputnik, everything changed. President Eisenhower authorized massive funding for the space program. January 31, 1958, 10:48 p.m., Cape Canaveral, Florida. A modified Jupiter C rocket developed by von Braun's team launched. At the top, Explorer 1, the first American satellite. 84 days after Sputnik, the Americans had caught up. The rocket was based on the Redstone, which in turn was based on the V-2. Von Braun, now 45 years old, held the satellite model over his head at the press conference. "America is in space!" The newspapers celebrated him as a hero. His Nazi past was discreetly forgotten. He became the face of the American space program. In 1960, NASA was officially founded. Von Braun became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. His mission: build a rocket that can take humans to the moon. President Kennedy announced the Apollo program in 1961, humans on the moon, before the end of the decade. Von Braun knew that this was the moment he had waited for his entire life. The boy who once dreamed of the stars would now realize humanity's greatest dream. The challenge was immense. The V-2 generated 25 tons of thrust. The Redstone generated 35 tons. But to get to the moon, you needed at least 3,400 tons of thrust. Von Braun had to build a rocket that was over 100 times more powerful than the V-2. His solution was brilliant and simple: multiple rocket stages. The Saturn V would have 3 stages. The first stage, SIC, would use 5 F1 engines, each with 680 tons of thrust, a total of 3,400 tons of thrust, enough to send 2,970 tons to the moon. The second stage, S2, would use 5 J2 engines with liquid hydrogen. The third stage, SIVB, would use a single J2 engine for the final thrust to the moon. The technology was radical, but the basic principles came directly from the V2, the turbopump technology, V2, the cooling systems, V2, the gyro stabilization, V2, the multi-stage construction concept developed in Peenemünde. A NASA historian later wrote, "The Saturn V was not a copy of the V2, it was its evolution. Without the V2, there would have been no Saturn V." November 9th, 1967, Cape Kennedy. The first unmanned test of the Saturn V, the rocket stood 363 feet tall, weighing 6.54 million pounds fully fueled. When the 5 F1 engines ignited, the Earth trembled 3 miles away. The noise, 204 decibels, was the loudest man-made sound to date. Grass burned half a mile away from the heat. The rocket rose slowly, then faster. Then it disappeared into the clouds. 11 minutes later, it was in orbit. Perfect. Von Braun, in the control center, exhaled. His entire life had been leading up to this moment. 16 more tests followed. 2 failed. But the Saturn V became reliable. On July 16th, 1969, everything was ready. July 16th, 1969. 9:32 a.m. local time. Cape Kennedy. 497 journalists from 56 countries, 1 million spectators lining the beaches. The Saturn V rocket, with Apollo 11 at its tip, stood poised on the launch pad. On board, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. In mission control, Wernher von Braun, 57 years old, graying hair, his face etched with tension. The countdown commenced. 10, 9, 8. At 6 seconds, the 5 F1 engines ignited. Flames erupted, shooting out 100 meters to each side. At 0, the restraints released. The rocket ascended slowly, majestically, with the force of 160 million horsepower. 3,000 tons of machinery carried 3 humans into space. Von Braun watched through the window, tears welling in his eyes. He thought back, 27 years since Peenemünde, 27 years since the V2. The same technology, the same hands, but this time, not for destruction, for dreams. 4 days later, on July 20th, Armstrong landed on the moon. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. 600 million people worldwide watched. It was the greatest triumph in human history. And it would have been impossible without Wernher von Braun and the V2 technology. The secret report that would later reveal the true depths of the connection was declassified in 1985. NASA engineers systematically analyzed the technical similarities between the V2 and the Saturn V. The findings were astounding. The turbopump technology of the F1 engines was based on 92% V2 design. The gyroscopic stabilization systems were almost identical, only larger. The combustion chamber cooling, identical principle. The multi-stage construction, a direct concept from Peenemünde studies from 1943. The report concluded, the Saturn V is the direct technical successor to the V2. Without the fundamental research in Peenemünde from 1937 to 1945, America would not have developed the technology for a lunar rocket until 1980 at the earliest. A Soviet aerospace engineer, Vasily Mishin, wrote in his memoirs in 1990, We and the Americans built on German technology. The difference was that America got the best German engineers. We got the second best. That is why they reached the moon, and we did not. The moral questions remained. How could a man who built weapons that killed thousands become an American hero? Von Braun himself wrestled with this question his entire life. In interviews he said, "I do not regret the V-2. I regret that it was used as a weapon. I always dreamed of the stars. The war forced me to use the technology for destruction, but I never stopped dreaming." Critics argued that this was too simple. Tom Lehrer, an American satirist, wrote a song in 1965. "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Wernher von Braun. The song made von Braun's moral ambiguity a joke, but the reality was more complex. Von Braun was a Nazi Party member since 1937, an SS member since 1940. He claimed he was forced to join to continue his research. Heinrich Himmler himself had him arrested in 1944, on suspicion of being more interested in space travel than in weapons. Von Braun was released after 2 weeks, but only because Dornberger argued that V-2 production would collapse without him. The question of forced labor haunted him more. Von Braun visited the Central Works factory, the underground facility, at least 15 times. He saw the conditions. A survivor, Adam Kabala, said in an interview in 1995, "I saw von Braun in Central Works. He walked through the tunnels with SS officers. He inspected the rockets. He saw us. Skinny, sick slaves. He said nothing. He did nothing." Von Braun later denied knowing the full brutality. But documents that surfaced in the 1980s showed that he personally selected forced laborers for assembly at least once. The historical truth is uncomfortable. Von Braun was not a Nazi ideologue, but he was an opportunist who made moral compromises to realize his vision. He worked within a criminal system, profited from it, and looked away when crimes were committed. After the war, he justified it as necessary for the greater dream. Whether one accepts that is a personal moral question. These are not just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real people, real moral dilemmas, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten, because they force us to ask difficult questions. If these historical truths matter to you, then support me with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in NASA archives, to digitize declassified documents, to interview the last remaining witnesses. The story of Wernher von Braun was reconstructed from NASA archives, declassified Operation Paperclip documents, German war archives, and post-war interviews. Without your support, these complex stories could not be told. Help me preserve this history for generations to come, with all its complexity and moral ambiguity. What happened to Wernher von Braun after the moon landing? His story after Apollo is less known, but just as fascinating. After Apollo 11, there were 6 more successful lunar missions. Apollo 17 in December 1972 was the last. Von Braun already had plans for a permanent lunar base, a Mars mission by 1985, rotating space stations, but the political reality had changed. The Cold War was easing. Vietnam consumed budgets. The public lost interest after the first moon landing. In 1970, the NASA budget was cut by 30%. Von Braun's ambitious plans were rejected. In 1972, disappointed and frustrated, he left NASA. He was 60 years old and had worked for the American space program for 27 years. He became vice president of Fairchild Industries, an aerospace company. But his heart wasn't in it. He felt lost without the rockets, without the grand dream. In 1973, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer. The disease progressed rapidly. In his final years, von Braun gave several reflective interviews. He spoke openly about his life, his decisions, his regrets. In an interview in 1976, a year before his death, he said, "I have lived two lives, one for war, one for peace. The first I regret, the second fills me with pride, but I cannot separate them. The rockets that killed people and the rockets that took people to the moon were built by the same hands. That burden I will carry until my last day." He died on June 16, 1977, in Alexandria, Virginia, at the age of 65. His funeral was large, but not official. President Carter sent a message of condolence, but no government officials attended. The moral questions surrounding his past were still too controversial, but over 1,000 NASA employees, astronauts and engineers came. Neil Armstrong gave a speech. Wernher von Braun was the greatest rocket engineer in history. Without him, no human would have set foot on the moon. His past was complicated, but his contribution to humanity is immortal. The historical reassessment of Wernher von Braun began in the 1980s as more documents were declassified. Historians found evidence that complicated his image. In 1984, historian Michael Neufeld discovered documents showing that von Braun personally requested forced laborers from Himmler for Peenemünde in 1944. A letter, signed by von Braun, requested talented inmates for specialized work. This contradicted his post-war claim that he had nothing to do with forced labor. In 1995, Neufeld published a comprehensive biography, Von Braun, Dreamer of Space, Engineer of War. The book presented a balanced picture, a brilliant engineer who was morally compromised by his collaboration with the Nazi regime. Neufeld concluded, von Braun was no monster, but he was no innocent genius either. He knew more and did more than he later admitted. His legacy is both triumphant and tragic. The technical details of the connection between the V-2 and the Saturn V are fascinating to engineers. The V-2 used an engine with 25 tons of thrust, powered by liquid oxygen and 75% ethanol. The combustion chamber had 18 burners, which atomized and burned the fuel. The biggest problem was always cooling. At 2800 degrees, steel melts. Von Braun's team solved this through regenerative cooling. The ethanol fuel flowed through channels in the combustion chamber wall before it was burned, cooling the wall from the outside. This principle was directly adopted into the Saturn V. The F1 engines used kerosene instead of ethanol, but the cooling principle was identical. The turbopumps, which pumped the fuel into the combustion chamber, were another direct carryover. The V-2 turbopump was revolutionary. A small engine burned concentrated hydrogen peroxide, driving a turbine, which in turn drove the pump. The Saturn V F1 turbopump used the exact same principle, only larger and more powerful. A NASA engineer who analyzed both systems said, "If you understand the V-2 turbopump, you understand 90% of the F1 turbopump. It's the same technology, scaled up." Gyro stabilization was another V-2 legacy. A rocket in flight is unstable, like a pencil balanced on its tip. Small deviations quickly amplify. The V-2 used a system of 3 gyros that stabilized the rocket in 3 axes. Sensors detected deviations, computers calculated corrections. Small graphite jet vanes in the exhaust stream steered the rocket. This system, developed in 1942, was ahead of its time. The Saturn V used an almost identical system, only with more modern electronic computers instead of the V-2's analog computers. The basic architecture was the same. An Apollo engineer explained, "We stood on the shoulders of giants. The giants worked in Peenemünde. That's the truth. Without their fundamental research, we would have had to reinvent the wheel." The Soviet side of the story is equally interesting. After the war, Soviet troops captured Peenemünde and the Central Works Factory, ahead of the Americans in some cases, after them in others. They found the factories largely emptied, because von Braun had already moved most of the documents and key engineers to the west. But the Soviets found enough. They disassembled complete V-2 production facilities and shipped them to Russia. They recruited about 2,200 German technicians and engineers, less prominent than those who went to the Americans. The leading Soviet rocket pioneer, Sergei Korolev, studied the V-2 intensively. The first Soviet rocket, the R-1, was an exact copy of the V-2, built from German parts with German help. The R-2, R-3, and R-5 were gradual improvements. The R-7, which launched Sputnik in 1957, was a much larger rocket, but its basic technology came directly from the V-2. Korolev wrote in his diary in 1947, "The Germans gave us 10 years. We must learn quickly." The Soviets learned quickly, but one difference was crucial. The Soviets forced the German engineers to work, deported their families. After 1950, most were sent back to Germany because Stalin didn't trust them. America treated von Braun and his team better, gave them freedom, respect, resources. That's why the American rockets were ultimately more successful. The ethical debate over Operation Paperclip continues to this day. Critics argue that the US abandoned moral principles in order to advance technologically. Supporters argue that the Cold War required pragmatic decisions. A middle ground argument is, Operation Paperclip was politically necessary, but the way it was carried out, with forged documents and lies, was unacceptable. Dr. John Gimble, a historian, wrote in 1990, Operation Paperclip was one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. It gave America a decisive advantage in the Cold War. But it was also one of the most morally questionable. We imported men who had worked for a criminal regime, and we lied about their past. The result did not fully justify the means. We should have been more transparent. A little-known detail. Von Braun was not the only prominent paperclip scientist. Arthur Rudolph, the production manager of the V-2 and later the Saturn V program, was deeply involved in the forced labor at the Central Works Factory. In 1984, when evidence surfaced, Rudolph fled to Germany to avoid prosecution. He lost his American citizenship. Hubertus Strughold, the father of space medicine, conducted medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. He worked for NASA until 1968. Kurt Debus, the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, was an SS member. He directed launches from Cape Canaveral until 1974. These men became American heroes, despite their past. NASA argued, "We judge them on their work for America, not their past." But Holocaust survivors argued, they profited from our slave labor and were never held accountable. This tension was never fully resolved. The technological legacy is undeniable. Without V-2 technology, America might not have achieved the 1960s moon landing. Maybe the Soviets would have won the space race. Perhaps space exploration would have been delayed by decades. The V-2 immensely accelerated human spaceflight. But at what price? 20,000 deaths during construction, 9,000 deaths caused by the weapon itself, tens of thousands of lives for a technology. Von Braun argued that these lives were not in vain, because the technology ultimately took humanity to the stars. Critics argue that no technology justifies the death of tens of thousands. A Holocaust survivor who worked at the Central Works Factory said in a 1995 interview, "I saw the moon landing on television. I knew that the rocket was built by the same hands. I felt mixed emotions, pride for humanity anger about the injustice, grief for my dead friends, all at the same time. Modern spaceflight still stands on this foundation. The SpaceX Falcon 9, the Blue Origin New Glenn, the NASA SLS, all used principles developed at the Peenemünde Army Research Center: liquid rocket propellants, turbopumps, gyroscopic stabilization, multi-stage rockets. These concepts are fundamental. Elon Musk said in a 2012 interview, "All modern rockets are descendants of the V-2. That's just fact. Von Braun and his team laid the groundwork. We're improving details, but the basic principles are the same. This is not an endorsement of their moral choices. It's recognition of their technical brilliance." That statement sums up the modern view: technical respect, moral ambivalence. What impressed you the most? Many viewers have shared incredible perspectives. Some argue that science is morally neutral, that we should use discoveries regardless of their source. Others argue that we must never forget the moral compromises made for progress. Share your family history or your opinions below. Did anyone in your family work on the German rocket program or the American space program, or were you a witness to this history? I'm especially interested in, how do you navigate the moral complexity of this story? Can we separate technology from the hands that created it? Your comments are part of this ongoing historical discussion.